Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are continuing with the reading of Thousand Autumns, also known as Shen Qiao by Meng Xi Shi, and we'll be covering 3 extra chapters: Wish, Ren Ying, and Naming. Okay, I hope you all enjoy. Wish. Over 200 miles of golden sand, stretching as far as the eye could see. The Gobi Desert seemed as though one could walk for their entire life and never reach its end. The noisy wind battered his face. It was painful. Yin Chuan had already gone a full day and night without any water. Sand blew into his mouth and nose with every breath, and his throat ached as if it were being scraped with a knife. But still, he had to keep going. If he didn't, and his pursuers caught up to him, all that awaited him would be death. He didn't know how long he'd been walking. Stretching far ahead and into the distance was the same expanse of yellow. Yin Chuan was almost in despair. The sword on his back felt abnormally heavy, impacting his pace and breathing. It was so heavy he longed to unfasten and fling it far away. But he couldn't do such a thing. The sword existed with the man. When the sword perished, the man did as well. Yin Chuan's family was owed a blood debt, and they were waiting for him to collect it. His sweat trickled down his forehead, dripping into his eyes and blurring his vision. As the wind howled around him, Yin Chuan thought he could still hear his own panting. Though his body had already reached its limit, almost unable to keep going, one thought remained in his heart, preventing him from giving up, stopping him from collapsing. From the distance came the sound of hoofbeats. Yin Chuan didn't know if he was really hearing pursuers or if he was already exhausted to the point of hallucination. But they once again drove his survival instincts to take over. Somehow, his legs filled with strength, and he even quickened his steps. This gentleman was once so handsome, a jade tree in the wind. Yet after a few days of rushing around, he's become so wretched. Just seeing him makes my heart ache. The gentle, lovely voice elicited no surprise, joy, or curiosity within Yin Chuan. Instead, it was like he'd seen a ghost, his face filled with terrified shock. The reason was simple. Just now, there'd clearly been no one nearby, yet the voice had suddenly exploded within his ears. Unless something had gone wrong with his hearing, this meant that the other party's martial arts vastly outstripped his. Yin Chuan summoned all the strength within his body and sped up even more, yet that voice clung to him like his shadow, following him without pause. Why does the gentleman ignore me? Is my beauty not enough for you to stop? Yin Chuan's hands trembled faintly. His legs no longer seemed to be his own. They were aching and sore to the point of numbness. His dantian was completely empty, his true qi utterly exhausted. Finally, he couldn't hold out any longer, and he collapsed right to the ground. That voice sputtered a laugh, then said sweetly, "Oh my, this gentleman, so pitiful. This one will lend you some help." A hand so soft it seemed almost boneless gripped Yin Chuan's shoulder before effortlessly lifting him right off the ground and placing him beneath a tree. Yin Chuan gasped for breath, then scrubbed away the sweat on his brow. His vision gradually cleared, and he saw a young woman dressed in red with a pretty face standing in front of him. She was staring at him, smiling as she played with her hair. The days he'd spent fleeing had transformed Yin Chuan from a wealthy young master who knew nothing of dangers and hardships to a man full of vigilance at all times, both as he slept and woke. Even with the girl's harmless appearance, he dared not underestimate her. "Why was this maiden following me?" he asked, incredibly cautious. The girl smiled. "Naturally, it was because you're handsome." Yin Chuan took a gulp of water from water skin he'd been carrying on his person. This soothed his throat somewhat. "Many thanks for the maiden's kind words. I'll be leaving now. May we meet again in the future." For a girl in the spring of her youth to appear in the Gobi Desert and to even follow a man she'd never seen, Yin Chuan pretended that he hadn't noticed anything strange. Once he felt that his strength had returned somewhat, he quickly stood and made to leave. But the next moment, a single line from that girl stopped him dead in his tracks. I heard that the lord of the Yin family had a veritable host of concubines, indulging himself nightly. So why does the young master act like a nestling who's never seen a woman before? So she had known his identity, and she'd come with something in mind. Yin Chuan's gaze instantly turned wary, and his hands slightly tightened around his sword. Seeing this, the girl laughed. You can't even defeat me. What's the point of putting on such an act? Yin Chuan only saw a blur. In an instant, his sword had already flown from his hand, landing nearby, and his acupoints had also been struck, leaving him unable to move. Who are you exactly? Yin Chuan was both furious and panicked. I'm called Liu Xufei. The girl introduced herself with a face wreathed in smiles. I know that someone's pursuing you. If you're willing to enter Hehuan sect, I can guarantee your safety. The Yin family had no martial arts background. Yin Chuan himself was only a mediocre practitioner. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to subdue him so easily. But he still knew about Hehuan sect. Under the leadership of the sect leader Bai Zhong, their power and influence was expanding with each passing day, especially now that they'd received the favor of the current emperor. Rumor had it that they, together with Buddhism, had divided the emperor and empress's support between them. I'm not a member of the Jianghu, said Yin Chuan. This yin can only accept the maiden's kind intentions. Liu Xufei didn't grow angry at his rejection and only continued to smile. An ordinary man bears no sin, but holding a precious stone will cast him as a sinner. Most of your family's wealth has been hidden, and only you, the next head of the Yin family, would know where it is. The people of Tuyuhuan are eager to restore their country, so they'll never let you go. Yet you lack the ability to protect those things. Sooner or later, you will fall into their hands. Instead of letting this happen, why not join Hehuan sect and receive our protection? We won't gobble up the Yin family's entire fortune. At least, we'd split it half and half with you. What does Ying Langjun think? 4 years ago, Yang Guang had ascended the throne and subsequently launched a war against Tuyuhuan. He annihilated Tuyuhuan in one fell swoop, then turned upon the Yin clan, the wealthiest family in Tuyuhuan. The Yin family suffered a massacre, and Yin Chuan alone had managed to escape. After the Yin family's destruction, the court ferreted out quite a fortune. But it was a far cry from the legends that had claimed the Yin family possessed enough wealth to rival a country's. Thus, a rumor had quietly spread claiming that the key to the Yin family's treasury was hidden on Yin Chuan, and only he knew where that treasury lay. As a result, Yin Chuan, who'd yet to discover his senses after his clan's massacre, found himself the target of pursuit from all directions. The Sui dynasty's imperial court, the remnants of Tuyuhuan's power, both were looking for him. And now even Hehuan's sect had come knocking. Yin Chuan forced a smile. I won't lie to the maiden. I've never had such a key, and the Yin family has no treasury. Though my ancestors amassed a large fortune, my father squandered everything long ago, and the imperial court has already looted the rest. I have nothing at all. Liu Xufei naturally didn't believe him. The Yin family had hosted a great number of guests. Everyone knew their members drank from cups made of glaze, that even their chopsticks were made of gold and inlaid with jade. The crafty hare keeps 3 burrows. Who'd believe that the Yin family would fail to leave themselves a way out? Liu Xufei was said sweetly, From what I know, the people of Tuyuhuan aren't only after your fortune. They're after your life. Hehuan sect only wants half of your family's wealth, and will even guarantee your safety. Is Ying Langjun incapable of weighing his options and making the correct choice? My only fear is that once I fall into your hands, the decision won't be mine to make. Liu Xufei was somewhat astonished. She hadn't expected that this tender and pampered youth would be capable of thinking this deeply. She gave a small smile. You've considered this quite thoroughly. But isn't there one thing you fail to realize? The decision isn't yours, even now. She stretched her arm forth, and her red sleeve fluttered with an airy fragrance, bringing to mind the charming scene of Jiangnan in late spring, gentle and exquisite. Already immobilized, Yin Chuan could only helplessly watch as that hand drew closer. There was nothing he could do. Yet in the end, the hand of that girl in red never touched Yin Chuan. The next instant, a blur swept before him, and then she was fighting a man. Yin Chuan didn't rejoice that he'd been saved. Instead, his complexion grew worse. He recognized this man. This man was the reason he'd spent the past few days fleeing for his life. Cheng Lugui, the disciple of Tu Yuhuan's state preceptor, the Kosa sage. The two parties' robes flapped and danced as their internal energy swept forth, pouring out in vigorous waves. Only the immobile Yin Chuan found himself suffering, as from time to time the waves would assault him. Needless to say, he was rather dejected. Yin Chuan thought that the two of them were like dogs biting and tearing at each other over a chunk of fatty meat, and his unlucky self was that meat, left to the mercy of others. No matter who won here, it would do him no good. Liu Shufei was clearly vastly superior to Cheng Lugui in martial arts. Cheng Lugui was quickly reduced to wretchedly defending himself, and Liu Shufei smiled all the while. This young gentleman didn't practice his martial arts properly. You should return to your Shifu's bosom and drink a few more years' worth of milk. Why did you show up here just to embarrass yourself? She was so delicately pretty, yet her words were so harsh and venomous. They'd make a person wish they could crawl into a whole lot of shame. Cheng Lugui was furious. His face flushed crimson. In halting Han speech, he said, "You should mind your own business. This isn't the Central Plains, and it's certainly not your Huhuan sect's territory. If you stick your hand in too far, careful that it doesn't get lopped off." Liu Shufei smiled brightly. "I would love to be lopped, but I fear you lack the ability. Would this venerable one have the strength then?" A voice carrying a hint of age suddenly rang out. Though it sounded unremarkable, Yin Chuan suddenly fell to the ground. Buzzing filled his ears, and a muffled pain woke in his chest. He almost coughed up a mouthful of blood. Liu Shufei, who'd been holding victory in her grasp, suddenly went pale. Being faster to detect danger compared to Yin Chuan, her red robes drifted backwards, her movements as graceful as a butterfly's, and she alighted on a tree branch. A person was standing upon that flimsy tree branch, yet it only swayed a little. Liu Shufei wiped away her look of shock, her bright smile returning. So it was the state preceptor of Tu Yuhuan. This little girl apologizes for her disrespect. The Kosa sage wore a kasaya, yet it wasn't in the style of the Central Plains Buddhists. Instead, he was dressed like a monk from beyond that territory. His face was average, his brows arched toward his temples, and his eyes were both narrow and dull. He appeared only around 40 years of age. If not for Liu Shufei's exposing his identity, Lin Yinchuan would never have guessed this man to be one of the world's foremost martial arts masters, as famous as the likes of Huanyue sect leader Yan Wushi and Xuandu Mountain sect leader Shen Qiao. In front of this man, Liu Shufei had to be exceedingly careful. Even if her face was smiling, it couldn't conceal the wariness within. "Is your esteemed sect leader Song doing well?" asked the Kosa sage. Liu Shufei started, but she instantly recovered her smile. "I fear that it's been too long since the sage has visited the Central Plains, and he's grown a bit muddled. Currently, for us, sect leader Bai is in charge." "Is that so?" said the Kosa sage coolly. "When I was in the Central Plains in the past, Bai Zhong was merely a little girl, still wet behind the ears. Now she's even posing as the sect leader, and her disciples, too, have no aptitude to speak of. Truly, each generation is inferior to the last." Liu Shufei's expression stiffened slightly. Though she was enraged, she dared not voice it. "The sage speaks too seriously. With our leader running things, Huhuan sect has become larger and stronger than ever, far more than when sect leader Song was around. If the Kosa sage is willing to travel to the Central Plains and visit us as a guest, Huhuan sect will extend to him the warmest of welcomes." The Kosa sage laughed loudly, yet the sound was uniquely cold and apathetic. "A sage whose leader earned her spot through her women's charms, enchanting an emperor of the Central Plains, dared to call itself strong? Don't think that this venerable one is unaware of all your two-faced dealings." As he spoke, his entire person rose into the air, seemingly without pushing off anything, completely spontaneous. In the blink of an eye, he was in front of Liu Shufei, his robe and sleeves sweeping toward her as if blown by the wind. Liu Shufei paled with shock. She knew without a doubt that if his palm strike connected, she'd instantly suffer broken bones and a mouthful of blood. There was no time to think more, let alone concern herself with the nearby Yin Chuan. She flung herself backwards straight away, letting herself fall. Right before she brushed the ground, her palms landed first and patted it slightly. With that, her entire body flipped and turned. In an instant, she'd retreated dozens of steps. Even so, it was clear that Liu Shufei didn't dare to pause for a moment. She turned and ran right after landing, never sparing a single glance back. In the twinkling of an eye, she'd vanished without a sight. "The sage is a noble and virtuous man," a sweet voice drifted to them from afar. "Shufei had the fortune of meeting him today and was overjoyed. I will not forget to return to tell my master and elders and come again when invited. I'll leave that kid for the sage to deal with." Confused, Chen Lugui asked, "Shitsuan, why didn't we just capture that demoness?" "She and Bingxian are Baizhong's favorite disciples. Capturing them doesn't benefit us and would only start a feud with Hehuan's sect. That isn't our goal." That was enough to stop Chen Lugui from speaking. Yin Chuan watched as Liu Shufei left, leaving only master and disciple, the Kosa sage, and Chen Lugui. His heart couldn't help but despair. He'd thought that they'd fight. When two tigers fought, one would inevitably fall, giving him the chance to escape. Instead, Liu Shufei had lost and retreated with such speed, dashing his hopes. Now that he'd fallen into the Kosa sage's hands, he feared what awaited him would be a fate worse than death. While his thoughts were spiraling, Chen Lugui had begun walking in his direction. He grabbed Yin Chuan's shoulder, then viciously flung him to the ground. "Didn't you still want to run?" "Run! Let's see where you can run to." Yin Chuan gritted his teeth and endured the pain. "Benefactor Yin, Tu Huan was destroyed by the Sui dynasty's Yang clan, and they also exterminated your family. We should be working together. If you're willing to hand over your family's belongings, once the revival is complete, Tu Huan will dispatch troops to attack the Sui dynasty, and your blood debt can be repaid. This way you can kill two birds with one stone, so why must you be so stubborn?" This wasn't the first or second time Yin Chuan had heard such words. The other party simply refused to believe that the Yin family's vast riches had been squandered completely. Yin Chuan didn't feel like arguing, so he simply closed his eyes and remained silent. Chen Lugui sneered, "Shitsuan, this brat is far too stubborn. I'll make him open his mouth." He extended 2 fingers and pinched Yin Chuan's shoulder, then slid them downward. As he did, cracking noises rang out along the arm, and Yin Chuan could withstand it no longer. He began to scream in pain. "Rending muscle from bone. Why go so far?" In the middle of this extreme agony and torture, Yin Chuan seemed to hear that voice sigh. However, he was completely incapable of sparing the attention to recognize it. He even thought he'd heard wrong. A stone flew toward Chen Lugui's wrist. The Kosa sage gave a cold sneer, raising his sleeve to tap it to the ground. However, Chen Lugui could no longer continue with his torture of Yin Chuan. It seemed that someone had secretly struck him from behind. He only felt a pain along his back. His acupoint had also been struck, leaving him unable to move. At the same moment, the Kosa sage realized that something was wrong with his disciple. He immediately freed Chen Lugui's acupoint, but paid no further attention to Yin Chuan. Instead, he was both shocked and furious. He was furious at how his opponent had fainted, then struck from elsewhere, and at how their sneak attack had succeeded right beneath his nose. And he was shocked at how audacious this person was, at their supreme confidence. Clearly, they were terrifyingly strong. The other party had no intentions of lurking out of sight. After their strike, they emerged from behind a tall boulder not too far away. Fluttering Taoist robes, a face that was serene and handsome. He looked like an immortal. The Kosa sage was in no hurry to strike. Once one lived to his age, They'd naturally developed the ability to assess all kinds of things. Though the man looked young, he possessed incredible martial prowess. One couldn't determine his age based on his appearance. A list of people within the Jianghu with reputations on par with his own quickly surfaced within his mind. It wasn't difficult for him to identify the man in front of him. To think that the great and lofty Shendu Mountain sect leader would perform a surprise attack on his junior, like a coward. He truly fails to live up to his reputation. Shen Qiao smiled. Yet the Kosa sage tolerates his disciple hurting a junior. That doesn't seem too just and upright of him either, now does it? His tone was gentle, without even a trace of provocation or anger. Enduring immense agony, Yin Chuan opened his eyes to stare blankly at Shen Qiao. He didn't know whether this man's arrival meant his salvation or another fresh round of suffering. Inwardly, the Kosa sage was frowning. Their current location wasn't a lively one, and yet first Hehuan sect had showed up, and now it was Shendu Mountain. It was clear that the Yin family situation was known to all now. To prevent further delays from causing future problems, he had to quickly lead Yin Chuan away. There's history between our Tu Yuhun and Yin Chuan, and he's taken things that should belong to Tu Yuhun, so my venerable self must naturally take him away. I asked Taoist Master Shen to mind his own business. Hearing this, Yin Chuan was stunned. Unable to concern himself with anything else, he shouted, "Save me, Taoist Master Shen! I didn't take anything that belongs to Tu Yuhun." Shen Qiao cast a glance at Yin Chuan, then said to the Kosa sage, "He isn't the sage's disciple, so could the sage give me some face and allow me to take him away?" The Kosa sage sneered, "Taoist Master Shen, your words are terribly bizarre. On what grounds must my venerable self hand someone of mine to you?" Once these words fell, he ignored whatever reply Shen Qiao might have had and simply struck at him. Qi surged forth, like the wind wailing through forests and mountains, sweeping through the cloud-cloaked peaks. It rose and fell as it swept out, and Yin Chuan only felt an enormous pressure bearing down on his head, which immediately began to throb as nausea overcame him. Shen Qiao promptly acted. He raised his sleeve and severed the Kosa sage's qi, reversing it right after. Kneading the true qi into an orb, he flung it back to the original cinder. The Kosa sage's robes billowed upward as one. He was no longer in his original spot. But Shen Qiao didn't raise his head. Instead, he stepped forward. The instant he moved, a figure appeared in a spot where he'd been standing. It was the Kosa sage. Yin Chuan watched with round eyes, shock and terror intertwining. Only now did he grasp the true profundity of the Kosa sage's martial prowess. The only reason he'd been able to run so far before was because Cheng Lugui's Shifu had never personally shown up. The moment he swept forward, Shen Qiao grabbed his sword, and Shan He Tongbei emerged from its sheath. He leapt into the air and performed a reverse downward slash. Wherever the sword glare reached, sparkling lights closely followed, its majesty resonating with both heaven and earth. The Kosa sage's expression shifted slightly. He dared not receive this blow, but he instead chose to withdraw and fell back. But the moment he drew back, he realized with a shock his own lack of will to fight, that he even wished to retreat in the first place. Even if his abilities should have been on par with Shen Qiao's, this momentary slip would ensure his defeat. Sure enough, the sword glare followed him in hot pursuit. Shen Qiao's figure didn't pause for even a second. His sword qi surged forth, slicing a section of the Kosa sage's sleeve right off. Shen Qiao used this chance to pull Yin Chuan behind himself. Only then did he stop and stand tall with his sword. The Kosa sage's complexion shifted erratically. The Shendu Mountain sect leader is indeed worthy of his reputation. The sage is too kind, Shen Qiao said generously. If you'd gone all out, I fear that I too wouldn't have gotten off easily. Hearing these words, the Kosa sage's heart eased a little. But as he just watched the duck he'd cook fall into Shen Qiao's hands, he was naturally unwilling to let this matter rest. I heard that after Yang Guang ascended to the throne, he renounced the relationship Yang Jian previously had with Taoism and went to support Buddhism instead. Logically speaking, Tu Yuhun's desire to revive our nation shouldn't conflict with Taoist Master Shen's interest at all. On the contrary, we can work together instead. If Taoist Master Shen is willing to hand over Yin Chuan, my venerable self can cede half of the Yin family's fortunes to him. Shen Qiao shook his head. The sage has a couple of things wrong. The Taoist discipline's collaboration with Yang Jian has never been a relationship of the supporter and supported. Yang Guang's closeness with the Buddhist discipline is his own concern. For all things in the world, as long as they can move with the flow, they'll naturally thrive. Taoism is this way, and dynasties are as well. I passed through this area returning from the western regions back to the Central Plains, and my intervention just now is wholly unrelated to anyone's wealth. Besides, even if the Yin family possessed immense wealth, that belongs to the Yin family. Since Yin Chuan is unwilling to give it to the sage, why does he demand it by force? The Xhosa sage sneered. As expected of the head of Taoism, wholly pompous and full of sanctimonious nonsense. What if my venerable self demands it by force? It's important to be self-aware, you bald old donkey. Shen Qiao hadn't said these words, and it was even more absurd to imagine they could come from Yin Chuan. They seemed to have emerged out of thin air. The Xhosa sage's expression twisted drastically. When Shen Qiao had arrived on this scene, he was preceded by hints of his presence, but there was no trace of this new speaker to be found. The Xhosa sage had no idea where this other man was hiding, or even how long he might have been eavesdropping. He hadn't noticed at all. Who is it? Chung Lugui yelled as he scanned all around him. Enough with the tricks! Then they saw a man leap down from a nearby tree, one that was practically bare and had few leaves left. Before now, there'd been no one on that tree. Seeing the newcomer, Shen Qiao revealed an expression of helplessness. Didn't I tell you to wait for me at the inn? Yet again, you came to stir up trouble. The man's temples were faintly white, but his face was terribly handsome as he smiled. There's nothing to do around here. I didn't expect to see something so entertaining. The new man's appearance was so striking, the Xhosa sage was instantly able to guess his identity. Yan Wushi? Now his expression had finally changed completely. A single Shen Qiao was already a thorny problem for him, and now the world's foremost martial arts master was here as well. He'd immediately lost all chance of victory. It was almost as if the name possessed a magic power. All who heard it would pale with horror. Chung Lugui held his sword across his chest, his guard incredibly high. Even so, this action was of little use. Yan Wushi raised an eyebrow as he regarded the Xhosa sage. I heard that in the last year's top 10 rankings, you placed 5th, advancing by several ranks. My venerable self's heart has been restless ever since. Why don't we have a spar? The Xhosa sage's mouth twitched. My venerable self still has some important matters to attend to. I'll keep this incident with Yin Chuan in mind for now and seek martial guidance from the two of you another day. With that, he grabbed his disciple and left. His Qing Gong had just reached the stage of transcendence. Within a few steps, he was already dozens of yards away from Shen Qiao and Yan Wushi. Yan Wushi had no desire to give chase. Instead, he said to Shen Qiao, I scared him off. Shen Qiao thought this somewhat comical, but also couldn't help but say, the Xhosa sage has been in secluded meditation for many years, so his martial prowess is naturally extraordinary. When I exchanged blows with him just now, I discovered that his strength was not inferior, but rather comparable to mine. Alas, he's too anxious to revive his country, so he stumbled on his own inner demons. Yan Wushi gave a light humph. No need to concern ourselves with him. Let's go eat. He tugged at Shen Qiao and made to leave. Yin Chuan suddenly realized that he could move. Seeing Yan Wushi's actions, he tossed aside the agony his arm was in and threw himself over, wanting to cling to Shen Qiao. But with the flick of Yan Wushi's wrist, he was sent tumbling back again. This one is Yin Chuan. He asked the esteemed Taoist Master Shen to accept him as his disciple. I'm stronger than he is, said Yan Wushi curiously. So why are you asking him and not me? Yin Chuan dared not say anything like, I heard that you were mercurial and erratic. So he could only answer, my late father held the esteemed Taoist Master Shen in great esteem, and there were those who received his kindness among the Yin family's guests as well. So this disciple admires the esteemed Taoist Master Shen's demeanor greatly and hopes that he can serve at his side. Even cleaning and odd jobs would be a great honor. Yan Wushi bluntly sneered at him. Isn't this just seeking protection from the capable? By clinging to Ah Qiao, You'll no longer be hunted down." Those words flayed Yinchuan's intentions wide open. His face grew a little red, but fortunately, he tanned quite a bit while he'd been fleeing for his life these days, so it wasn't too obvious. "Do you wish to learn martial arts to take revenge?" asked Shen Qiao. Yinchuan shook his head and smiled bitterly. "This junior will be honest. My personality was slothful, and the couple of masters who taught me martial arts in the past all said that I lacked talent. Most of the time, I was only interested in calligraphy and painting. If I weren't so useless, I wouldn't have been unable to save my family and ended up as the only survivor. Furthermore, it's true that the reason the Yin family was eradicated was that the tallest trees attract wind, but we ourselves held some culpability as well. This was the result of the cycle of karma." Shen Qiao gave a slight smile. "A straightforward person indeed. You're not untalented, but you're unsuited for Xuandu Mountain, as well as Huanyue sect." Yinchuan only thought the other party was politely declining him. Though he was disappointed, having the fortune of encountering a martial arts grandmaster in the first place, and even being saved by him, was already a blessing. It would have been truly inappropriate to grow resentful, so he respectfully said, "This junior understands." Shen Qiao laughed. "I didn't finish. Though we won't take you as our disciple, there's only one person who is very suited to be your shifu." A light at the end of the tunnel. Yinchuan's spirit soared. "Linchuan Academy's Zhang Ziqian," said Shen Qiao. "Though he's only above average in martial prowess, he's a renowned master painter of these times. However, I can only take you to him. Whether he's willing to accept you will depend on himself." Yinchuan was overjoyed. "Everyone knows of Master Zhang's name. If I can be his esteemed self's disciple, this junior could die 100 deaths without regrets." Yan Wushi, however, was unhappy. "You're going to drag this load back with us to the Central Plains?" Shen Qiao smiled. "It's no trouble at all. If I can help someone, I will. The most that will happen is that I return with you to Huanyue sect after taking him to see Zhang Ziqian. How about it?" Yet Yan Wushi deliberately questioned him. "Oh, didn't Bai Zhong invite you to attend a spring outing banquet? You're not going?" Shen Qiao shook his head. "Currently, Hehuan sect is too involved in Yang Guang's interests, so I'm unwilling to see her. We'll meet again in the future." Yan Wushi sneered. "The mountains and rivers are easier to change than one's character. Hehuan sect has always been this way. Don't relapse into your annoying habit of getting all tender and soft." Shen Qiao was at the end of his rope. The two of them walked as they conversed. Though their pace didn't seem fast, they flowed as smoothly as the clouds and rivers. In a moment, they were already far away. Yinchuan panted and gasped. He was about to fall behind, but then he saw that Shen Qiao had already stopped and was waiting for him with a smile. Seeing that he'd be able to see the person he'd admired his entire life, Yinchuan felt his body fill with inexhaustible energy, and he quickly ran to catch up. There would always be hope ahead. Ren Ying. The winter winds were bitterly cold, their chill piercing straight to the bone. A roaring whistle sounded, and an arrow grazed right by his ear. Ren Ying's chest and lungs burned in pain. Each breath he drew felt like knives gouging into his flesh, but he had no choice except to run. If he didn't, he'd be dead. Ever since childhood, he toiled away in the lowest of jobs. He might have had little else, but his legs were fairly good at running. But his pursuers drew closer and closer, yelling as they hefted their torches. They were even full of good food and drinks, well satiated, while Ren Ying hadn't eaten for a full day and night. He was running entirely on his last dregs of willpower as he cut through the forest, then passed a hill. If he continued running like this, he'd ultimately suffer capture and a sound beating. In the end, it'd only been because he'd been starved to desperation and stolen a cloth bundle from a household. It was heavy and filled to the brim with flatbread. He could even smell the aroma. Ren Ying made his decision. Even if they captured him, he'd hide the bundle or at least toss it away. He'd never let these people have it. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, he saw a glimmer of light before him. It was a night without stars or moon. That tiny feeble light flickered, and beneath the cover of the mountain forest, It seemed dimmer and more obscure than ever. But to Ren Ying, that tiny speck of light was akin to the stars or moon, shining brilliantly. He sprinted toward it without a second thought. Once he made out the scene before him, he realized that the light was coming from a broken-down temple. He was suddenly filled with regret. This shabby temple was utterly isolated. It must have been something like 800 years since someone had last worshipped or made offerings there. Why would there be a light? Could it be his pursuers' companions? If there was no back exit, wouldn't he soon find himself completely trapped? Ren Ying was but a boy in his adolescence, after all. He wavered, thinking that he'd made the wrong judgment, but it was too late to turn back. He could only barge inside. A pile of burning firewood entered his vision. This was the source of the light he'd seen. However, behind the woodpile sat a man, currently warming himself by the fire. The man looked like a Taoist priest. His head was lowered, and he was half hidden in the shadows. The pattern of the 8 trigrams upon his robes was already vague and distinct. Though the wind blew fiercely outside, the fire had been raised in a corner, shielded by the door as it opened, and it hadn't been extinguished. Ren Ying quickly swept him a glance. He saw that the man's clothes were ragged, and he looked fragile and weak, not at all involved with the people relentlessly pursuing him. Thus, Ren Ying paid him no further heed and began searching for a back exit. This broken-down temple was letting in drafts from all sides, but a glance was enough to survey the entire thing. Even the Buddha statue was mottled and dilapidated, missing half its body. It was impossible to tell which Buddha it was supposed to be. Ren Ying ran several laps around the statue like a headless chicken, his heart despairing and panicked. The footsteps behind him drew closer and closer, and Ren Ying whipped his head around. A large swath of firelight had swiftly arrived, and 7 or 8 men were blocking the door. There was no escape. He should have never entered this temple. The early spring nights were cold, but Ren Ying's clothing was drenched in sweat. He clutched at the bundle in his arms and involuntarily took 2 steps back. "Brat, where are you going to run to next?" "You think you're tough? Keep running." Voices rose all at once, their gazes like knives, practically chopping him into various pieces. The man in front stepped out and extended his hand. "Give us the parcel." Ren Ying gritted his teeth, reluctant and unwilling, but he hurled it toward the man. The other person was holding a torch. Using only his free hand, he caught the angrily flung bundle. Rather than shoving it at his subordinates, he carried it himself. "Have you opened this parcel?" he asked Ren Ying. It wasn't an accent from the Central Plains, but one couldn't call his Mandarin imprecise, just somewhat strange. When would Ren Ying have had the time? He'd run right after stealing the bundle, terrified of being captured. The aroma of food would waft from time to time, but despite how starved he was, he'd forcibly endured it. But before the contemptuous stares of these men, he subconsciously refused to admit defeat. He straightened himself and retorted, "I opened it, so what?" As he was speaking, Ren Ying glanced at the nearby window out the corner of his eye. He thought that if these men came up to gang up on him, he'd jump right out of the window and flee. The sounds of trickling water came from outside. He was a strong swimmer. Perhaps he still had a way out. But before he could realize these thoughts, the man was already grabbing him. "Whether you've opened it or not, you'll be leaving your life behind today." The man's movements were terrifyingly swift. Thoroughly shocked, Ren Ying couldn't help but lift his chin and stumble back. When he'd been working for his boss, Ren Ying had learned a couple of moves. He considered himself nimble. Otherwise, he could have never held on for so long while so starved. But these men were supremely skilled, far beyond what Ren Ying had imagined. No matter how quick his reflexes were, he couldn't compare to that man's grab. A chilling aura and pressure engulfed him from the front, and his throat was tightly grasped. At that moment, murderous intent surged, and Ren Ying grew dazed from suffocation, his hands and feet losing the strength to struggle. As he watched the other party's mouth stretch maliciously, he suddenly realized something. These people were clearly exceptionally skilled. The entire way, they'd only hunted instead of capturing him. They'd let him exhaust himself before drawing in the nets, much like a cat would toy with a mouse between its paws. However, all he'd stolen was a parcel filled with food. If he hadn't been so hungry, if a little brother and sister hadn't been waiting at home for him, Ren Ying would have never taken the risk of provoking these men. They had enough to eat and drink. They didn't look like people who'd lack for one missing parcel of food. So why must they drive him to his death? In such tumultuous times, were the poor truly doomed to be unable to survive? Jumbled thoughts surged within his mind, and the hand around his throat tightened more and more. Out of the corner of his eye, he glimpsed the others, who turned to interrogating the man behind the fire. They thought that he was together with Ren Ying. Ren Ying opened his mouth. He wanted to tell the man to hurry up and leave, but he could no longer make any noise. His vision gradually darkened, and even his limbs had gone stiff and numb. Since he never opened it, why must he be so ruthless? Dimly, Ren Ying thought he heard a voice, both near and far, but he was unable to tell where it was coming from. Perhaps he was only hearing things before his death, he numbly thought. He knew that his death was imminent, that there lay a vast gap between their abilities. He'd already given up all struggle. But then the pressure on his body vanished, and there was a scream, one that hadn't come from his mouth. Ren Ying opened his eyes in a muddle and saw a man fly forward and land heavily upon the floor. The Taoist priest by the fire rose and dusted himself off. His clothes were disheveled, in a wretched state, yet his movements were as smooth as drifting clouds and flowing waters or a cool breeze kissing the moon. There wasn't a mote of dust on his face. Even those men had never imagined that someone so formidable would have appeared within this broken-down temple. He might have stolen something, but that's not a crime that warrants death, the stranger said. In your belief that someone was plotting after your things, you took him as bait. Now you've realized that it was only happenstance. Why not let him go? The Taoist wasn't at all flustered at the intrusion from these uninvited guests. He was as steady as a mountain, showing neither anger nor surprise. All who wandered the Jianghu knew that the more inconspicuous a person seemed, the less one could afford to provoke them. But this group seemed to have subconsciously concluded that he was the instigator behind Ren Ying. They instantly shot back with a sneer. "Ha! Let him go! Then you can take his place?" The man in front attacked first, while his men behind him split into two groups surrounding the Taoist. They'd wordlessly arranged themselves into a sword formation. Ren Ying didn't understand martial arts, but he could tell that the Taoist was in danger. 7 or 8 men drew their swords, their sword qi interweaving. For a moment, it was difficult to determine who was near or far. Ren Ying only felt a pressure slamming into his face from the front. He tried to back up, but he was stopped by a pillar. All he could do was flatten himself against it. He saw the Taoists surrounded, and he couldn't resist blurting out, "Careful!" He'd just said this when a bright laugh rang outside the temple. "An insignificant little sect from Yamato, and you're strutting about in the Central Plains?" Those words had exposed their identities. Hearing them, the faces of those 7 or 8 men fell. Just as they were thinking they'd finish off the Taoist before heading off to deal with that newcomer, the Taoist suddenly shook his sleeves and spread them. The men's sword formation instantly collapsed, and the shock waves caused 2 of their swords to shatter and fly from their owners' grasps. A couple of men reeled back several steps, disbelief written all over their faces. At this time, the laugh from outside drew closer, and the man strolled inside, his robes fluttering, his demeanor calm and composed. "It's only been a dozen days since I last saw you. How did our sect leader Shen end up this wretched?" The newcomer clicked his tongue twice, a smile on his lips. As he scanned his surroundings, he seemed to be looking at everyone, yet he also seemed to consider them beneath his notice. In the end, only the Taoist had been calmly accepted into the boundary he drew around himself. The Taoist seemed familiar with him. Hearing those words, the man shook his head, but didn't explain any further. Instead, he turned to the group of people. "Still going to fight?" The leader had heard the words sect leader Shen, and an ominous feeling surfaced within him. For a moment, his suspicious, wary gaze wavered between Shen Qiao and the newcomer. Shen Qiao didn't wait for them to figure out what was going on. He followed up with, "If you're not going to fight, it's my turn." Before the leader could react, he felt an all-encompassing pressure before him, enough to topple mountains and overturn seas. He instantly found himself unable to breathe, and before he could return the attack, he was forced to fall back. Unfortunately, he was still a step too slow. His subordinates could only helplessly watch as their leader was seized by Shen Qiao, completely unable to move. "What are you doing? Let go! How brazen!" Some of them had grown angry in their panic, even shouting in Japanese. Two of the men were about to rush forward, but they'd scarcely taken half a step when Shen Qiao forced them back with a single flick of his finger. The man beside him, who was dressed like a distinguished scholar, never intervened even once. He simply watched from the sidelines, his face full of smiles. But though he was only watching, those men from Yamato also felt an immense pressure from him. A single Shen Qiao was already too much for them, never mind the thought of adding another. Infiltrating the Central Plains and browbeating the common folk. To think that the great and mighty Shinbu sect, the foremost sect of Yamato, could do something so dishonorable. When he heard Shen Qiao's words, the leader paled right away. He subconsciously still wanted to struggle, but then a wave of agony pierced through his restrained shoulder, completely unexpected. He couldn't help but yell in pain as he slumped down, but because his shoulder was still in Shen Qiao's grasp, he could only forcibly support himself on his weak, limp legs. "This one is Asano Taku, disciple from Shinbu sect. May I ask if this distinguished master is sect leader Shun from Shendu Mountain, the world's foremost Taoist sect? Everyone says that sect leader Shun is benevolent and generous beyond compare. So why are his actions so ruthless? It's heavens and earths apart from his reputation. So please forgive me for failing to recognize you." His face was contorted in pain, yet he'd still remembered to probe Shen Qiao using psychological tactics. The man watching from the side suddenly burst into laughter. Showing mercy when the other side clearly bears ill intent. He scoffed. "You're describing an idiot, not sect leader Shun. Though our Aqiao is a little foolish, thanks to my teachings these past few years, he's at least able to weigh and judge things somewhat." His tone was frivolous, as if he was flirting with some uptown lady, but Asano Taku dared not underestimate him at all, because he could feel an invisible and terrifying presence emanating from the man. It was something impossible to describe. One could only feel it from grandmasters who'd achieved the summit of martial arts. Though Yamato had quite a few martial arts practitioners, there were practically none on the level of the two men in front of him. It also looked like the man was well acquainted with sect leader Shun, for the latter sent him a glance, yet remained completely silent. With two great martial artists on the scene, Asano Taku dared not act so unbridled. He could only endure the pain while explaining what was going on. According to Asano Taku, the Shinbu sect had only ended up in the Central Plains by chance. Originally, they'd been tracking down a missing token from their sect. They arrived in Goguryeo, where they'd clashed with the premier sect in Goguryeo, Tungjo. Quite a few members of Shinbu sect had been killed or injured, and disagreements emerged within Asano Taku's party. Some of them proposed returning to their sect first to report, then lay down a plan for the future since they'd suffered such heavy casualties. But others insisted that they should continue investigating until they found the token so they had something to bring back to the sect. Asano's group was the latter. They'd followed the faint trail all the way from Goguryeo to the Central Plains and discovered the token's whereabouts nearby. After a difficult and bloody battle, they managed to retrieve it, only to find themselves heavily surrounded, for many sects were also eyeing that token of theirs. Asano and his men had become like birds startling at the twang of a bow. They took everyone who approached them as thieves, even if they knew that Ren Ying's skills were mediocre, that he couldn't even qualify as a member of the Jianghu. They still couldn't help but suspect that there was someone behind him, so they'd wanted to use him to lure out the big fish. Yet they never expected that Ren Ying was really someone without any background or history, merely a starving thief. Instead, it was Asano and his party who charged headlong into a mighty mountain. No, two mountains. After haltingly explaining the ins and outs of his tale, Asano forced a smile to his face, acting humble and submissive. Though we possess eyes, we failed to recognize Mount Tai when it was right before us. We ask the two masters to forgive us and avoid lowering your esteemed selves to our level. A trivial sect token had all the sects hunting you down covetously, Shen Qiao said. You've been avoiding the important matters the whole time. Not once have you explained what that token is. Do you think we're that easy to fool? Shen Qiao disliked causing difficulties for others, but if not for his intervention, a boy would have died at their hands. Though Asano had detailed all their troubles, Shen Qiao still had no intentions of letting them off easily. Who knew if they'd attack someone else once they left? Sure enough, Asano revealed a reluctant expression and stammered, "Why not let me guess?" Wushi paced over slowly, his tone filled with the schadenfreude of one watching a grand show that had nothing to do with him. "A while ago, I heard that some disciples from Tongjiu's sect defected after carrying out a massacre with their sect, causing great chaos within Goguryeo for some time. Later, people from Goguryeo and Yamato showed up again and again within the Central Plains. Even Tu Yuhuan and the newly born Tibet ended up drawn into this matter. Ultimately, it was all due to the Mitake sword that found its way out of the Tongjiu sect. Legend says that the sword was blessed by the divine, and thus the wielder would be protected by a divine light, making them indestructible like the Vajra. Furthermore, the sword blade is carved with mountains and rivers, indicating the location of a treasure. Several groups have been vying for it without end. And now, even the sects of the Central Plains have caught wind of this and joined in one after another. Inside that parcel of yours is Mitake, right?" Asano's expression had flickered several times throughout Wushi's speech. Though he gritted his teeth and refused to utter a sound, that in and of itself was a tacit confirmation. Ren Ying only half understood what was going on. He was completely confused, but he still knew that the parcel he'd stumbled upon and stolen was actually a precious object that the Jianghu was fighting over. At once, he couldn't prevent his face from turning ashen. If someone hadn't suddenly popped up and saved him, he would have died here. Ren Ying subconsciously hid behind Shen Qiao, his hand gripping Shen Qiao's sleeve. Yet, he felt a faint prickling sensation upon his back and instinctively turned to look. He only saw the man who'd spoken earlier, who was standing behind the firelight, cast a glance toward him, and there was an invisible threat hidden in that gaze. Ren Ying shrank away and quickly withdrew his hand. Asano was worried that Shen Qiao and Wushi were also here to steal Mitake. He could scarcely imagine that the two were wholly uninterested in the object, for they spoke no further. Instead, they continued to stoke the fire, preparing to rest. Wushi even pulled out a small flask of xiaoju from his lapels. He handed it to Shen Qiao, who smoothly received it and took a swig, then returned it to Wushi. Then he procured a couple of pieces of flatbread and dry rations, giving them to Ren Ying to allay his hunger. Ren Ying thanked him repeatedly. He was clearly ravenous, yet he ate the food slowly. Even after a long time had passed, more than half of the palm-sized flatbread remained. "The bread isn't poisonous. You can be at ease," said Shen Qiao gently. Ren Ying shook his head, then awkwardly explained that his younger siblings at home had nothing to eat. He was terrified that the noble person before him would think that he was asking for more, and failed to notice that Shen Qiao's expression had gentled further. "I still have some dry rations here," said Shen Qiao, "though I can't give them all to you. You're alone and won't be able to hold onto so much food. Afterward, bring your siblings over. This place isn't far from Guyang City. You can settle them here for a while, then look for some work opportunities within the city." Ren Ying had considered entering the city before, but his siblings had been too hungry to walk. Left with no other choice, he could only set out alone and search for food, which was how he'd run into Asano's cohort. Asano was anxious and apprehensive, and he dared not make rash movements. But there were people in his party who didn't know Shen Qiao and Wushi's illustrious reputations and sought a chance to escape. One of them had just risen under the cover of darkness and taken 2 steps when his waist was struck twice. It'd been soundless and quick as lightning. The man hadn't even noticed what was going on before he'd fell sideways, collapsing to the ground and twitching ceaselessly. These years, no one in front of me has even dared to come and go freely without my permission. Yen Wushi remained completely calm, and his gaze upon Asano's group was filled with ridicule, as if he were a cat toying with a mouse. Asano did possess the capacity for sound judgment, and so he could endure. But the people around him couldn't. They immediately burst out with a yell and raised their weapons, slashing at Yen Wushi. Since Shen Qiao had done most of the attacking before, Asano's subordinates assumed that Yen Wushi would be easier to deal with. They aimed to take him hostage. This was truly an example of digging one's own grave, death-seeking behavior. One man had just raised his weapon over his head when he was sent flying. His sword shot out of his hands and toward the wall behind the Buddha statue, where the blade stabbed halfway in. Asano looked at his motionless subordinate and felt his mind crack completely. The feeble desire for resistance within him had already evaporated. He grew completely docile and obedient, fearing that even the slightest hint of disrespect would lead him to sharing the man's fate. Within Yamato, the Jinmu sect's power was such that they could do as they pleased. Being used to this, Asano had thought quite highly of himself. Even after arriving in Goguryeo and the Central Plains, at times he developed the mistaken impression that the foreign martial arts were below his notice, all because he'd never encountered any of the top martial artists. Now, he completely understood that a mistaken impression was just that. A mistake. The reason he'd never encountered any rivals was because he'd never met any top experts. Then Shen Qiao and Yen Wushi, the 2 great mountains, had come crashing down before him. Unable to scale them, he was left with sudden despair. He thought that today would become the day of his death, but then Yen Wushi airily let them all go. Get out. Don't let me see you ever again. Shen Qiao supplemented his words with his own. If your lot dares to seek revenge on this young friend of mine, Xuandu Mountain will become your enemy. Sect Leader Shun's threats are so lackluster. Yen Wushi commented in a chilly tone. Just tell them that you'll hunt them down to the edges of the world to punish them. That they'll be unable to die in one piece. Wouldn't that settle everything? Having witnessed how terrifying these men were, Asano dared not doubt the truth of Yen Wushi's words. He repeatedly kneeled and bowed, then stumbled back, swearing that he'd never dare take any kind of revenge on Ren Ying, thus showcasing completely their tendency to fall apart before the strong. Only afterward, when their group was a long distance away from the temple and they were certain Shen Qiao and Yen Wushi had let them go, did they finally allow themselves to sink to the ground. Meanwhile, inside the broken-down temple, Ren Ying had managed to survive a disaster. He stared blankly at Shen Qiao, as if he were in a trance. In the aftermath, a belated fear surged within him, and his eyes reddened. Shen Xianxiang, I'm worried about my siblings. Can I go pick them up first? I wish to thank and kowtow to these 2 gentlemen for their great kindness together with them. He'd moved his siblings to a broken-down kiln earlier. It let in the cold air from all sides, and the 2 children's stomachs rumbled with hunger. They lacked even the strength to truss a chicken. Anything could happen to them at any time. I'll go with you, Shen Qiao volunteered, then turned his head to say to Yen Wushi, I must trouble Yansheng to wait here a moment. I'll leave with our young friend. Then we'll soon be back. Yen Wushi prodded at the flames before saying icily, By the time you get back, my venerable self might be gone already. He'd put on great airs, yet Shen Qiao laughed in response. Then, Sect Leader Yan, you'll have to stoop to waiting a moment. Yen Wushi gave a slight snort, but spoke no further. Ren Ying was anxious and fearful. He didn't know who Yen Wushi was, but the man's presence scared and intimidated him on an instinctual level. He had no idea that, in that moment, Yen Wushi had already restrained himself quite a bit. One could even call his disposition pleasant. With Shen Qiao there, Ren Ying's reunion with his siblings went smoothly. The 2 children were so starved they seemed barely human. They could scarcely open their eyes. Ren Ying dared not feed them too much at once. He could only have them eat a bite at a time, waiting for them to gradually recover their strength. Only then was Shen Qiao able to ask about Ren Ying's brimming resentment and frustrations. When I was young, I heard my parents say that Emperor Wen replaced Zhou and vanquished Chen, unifying the lands, said Ren Ying. We thought that as common folk would be able to enjoy good days ahead. It's only been a few years since the emperor and court changed, so how did things end up this way? A great drought followed by a great flood. Our family lost everything and my parents passed away. Our house and farmlands were flooded too. Our chickens all died. It's fine if I starve to death, but what about my siblings? Where is the hope for us commoners? Will we still be able to survive? Even if he were nimble, and he learned a little martial arts, within these troubled times, he was little more than a leaf adrift on the wind with nothing he could rely on. There were thousands and thousands of people just like Ren Ying. Shen Qiao sighed. Before, I also believed that Great Sui, with Emperor Wen, would at least be able to enjoy several hundred years of peace. Looking at things now, it seems Yan Wushi was truly correct. Ren Ying was confused. What are you saying, sir? Shen Qiao burst out laughing. I'm saying that I know a little fortune-telling. But unfortunately, in all my divinations about the future, I'd failed to account for the human heart. Who would have thought that Emperor Wen and Empress Dugu, who'd been wise rulers their entire lives, would stumble in choosing their heir? Yang Guang indeed surpassed the emperor's other sons when it came to talents and intelligence, but when the entire world was already within one's hands, the key lay not in how nimble those hands were, nor in what miracles they could perform, but in how stable they were. And Yang Guang's hands were indeed more than nimble, but they were lacking in stability. He held great and lofty ambitions, surpassing dozens of emperors who came before him. The sole things he'd missed were the hearts and resources of the people. An eastern expedition, a transportation canal, and separating the military from the aristocracy and offending the powerful families. These three things were enough to topple his throne, and enough to cause the already short-lived nation to sway on the verge of collapse. Though Yang Guang still sat on the throne today, Shen Qiao could already see the crisis brewing beneath the facade of prosperity. Ren Ying knew nothing of this. He couldn't stand that high nor see that far. He only knew that his family and home had perished from natural disasters, and yet the court didn't care. Or perhaps the court lacked the ability to care. Ren Ying couldn't see any hope of survival, but for his siblings, he could only hold on bitterly. One day, if even his sole concern was gone, people with similar experiences to Ren Ying might simply grit their teeth and turn to the life of an outlaw. Perhaps then he'd gain some riches as he licked the blood from his sword, or perhaps he'd lose his life beneath the glint of blades. On this trip, Shen Qiao and Yan Wushi were just returning now from their wandering journey of several days to the western regions. Along the way, they'd witnessed the violent changes that had befallen the Central Plains, which was already to retread the fate of mistakes of the northern and southern dynasties. The hearts of the people wavered, and the Jianghu and court were irrevocably interlinked. Few of the world's sects were at peace. They seemed restless and poised to cause trouble, with each hatching their own plots. This was the way of the world. Those long divided must be united, and those long united must be divided. The only pity lay in the Sui dynasty's rough destiny. The unity had been too brief. Turbulence had arisen again in a flash. One could only sympathize with the innocent common folk, who could do nothing but drift along with the tide, lacking the agency. Thinking about this, Shen Qiao was at a loss. He could lead Shendu Mountain and even bring his sect to great heights, and he was unable to share these benefits with the world. A single person's strength was limited. No matter how skilled a martial artist they were, they could only protect the people around them. It was impossible to protect all the people in the world. Only good timing, good terrain, and the support of the people could give birth to an era of peace and prosperity. And how long this prosperity could be maintained depended on how clear-minded the ones in charge were. If you have nowhere to go, why not come with me to Xuandu Mountain? Shen Qiao suggested. There's a village at the foot of the mountain, and there are few bandits there. They were also fortunate enough to not suffer natural disasters this year. Your siblings can spend their days working while studying. It's much safer than wandering about outside. This was the method Shen Qiao had come up with to ensure that Ren Ying could settle down safely. Perhaps he was incapable of saving everyone in the world, but as long as he had the ability to help, it was impossible for him to watch from the sidelines. Ren Ying thanked Shen Qiao. Shen Qiao still felt that the youth's heart was heavy with worries and his spirits low, but his own mind was buzzing with thoughts, so he said nothing more. The four people walked silently back, all the way until they reached the broken-down temple and saw the faint glow of fire gleaming through the holes in the window paper. With this, the slight disappointment within Shen Qiao's heart, too, inexplicably scattered. An aroma wafted out along with the fire's glow. Ren Ying and his siblings' stomachs growled as one. Yan Wushi sat cross-legged behind the fire, playing with a long pole he held in his hand, his head lowered as he carved something upon it. Even when he spoke, he didn't look up. Ah, Qiao, if you wish to have these three eat some roast chicken, then guess what I'm doing right now. Ren Ying and his younger siblings all looked at each other, then stared at Shen Qiao. The corner of Shen Qiao's mouth twitched. You wish to carve a fake Mitake sword? Yan Wushi was all smiles. Sect Leader Shen knows me well. Here, this roast chicken is yours. From beginning to end, he hadn't made any excessive displays of power, but for some reason, Ren Ying and his siblings still held an instinctive fear and awe toward him. Hearing this, they looked at Shen Qiao. Only after Ren Ying saw him nod did he carefully shift himself over and thank Yan Wushi in a small voice before picking up a piece of roast chicken. Shen Qiao politely declined the food Ren Ying was trying to share with him and had the three of them move to the side, where they could warm themselves while eating. Then he sat down next to Yan Wushi. No matter how dexterous Sect Leader Yan's hands are, a simple bamboo pole can never become the true Mitake. What kind of ruse are you plotting this time? Do you know the origins of the Shinbu sect's name and why the Mitake sword is called Mitake? Yan Wushi asked, instead of answering. It's said that the first emperor of Yamato was called Emperor Jinmu, and Shinbu sect claims that they're the direct and legitimate descendants. That must be the reason for their namesake. As for Mitake, it's probably related to their belief in Shinto. Ah Qiao is indeed a man of great learning and ability. Now here's another test question. What does Mitake look like? This I have no clue. Has Sect Leader Yan seen it before? Ah Qiao, didn't you realize? The Mitake sword Asano's cohort had in their possession was also a fake. Of course Shen Qiao had noticed. Asano had allowed Ren Ying to run off with the parcel containing Mitake before giving chase. This was surely in hopes of reeling in a larger fish using a longer line. If the sword had been real, there was no way he'd be able to stand using it as bait. The real Mitake sword was never in Asano's hands at all. Them running about with a fake sword on their back is probably only a cover for the people with the real sword. Yan Wushi took the bamboo pole, polished and glossy, and wrapped it in silk. As he played with it, it really did look like it could be the genuine article. If I release some news saying that I chanced upon the real Mitake sword, what do you think those who hear of this will do? Many people will believe it to be true, and they'll employ all sorts of techniques, hatch all sorts of plots to obtain this bamboo pole from you. He especially emphasized the words bamboo pole. Yan Wushi's smile was full of malice. At that time, I'll find another reason to have this object end up in Asano's hands, then let the world know the truth. Then he won't be able to clear his name even if he leaps into the Yellow River. Shen Qiao was silent for a moment. They offended you today. I trust that they'll end up drowning in regret in the future. You happen to be here tonight. If that wasn't the case, this youth would have lost his life and his siblings their protection, and they would have died one after the other. Knowing this, can you still pity that bunch? I've never been able to outtalk you, said Shen Qiao. Yan Wushi smiled brightly. Then you should listen to me. The cold nights are long, and I've already warmed the wine. Only when he's full of food and drink can our sect leader Shun have the strength to cherish the world's people. Though his tone was mocking, if one listened closely, there was a hint of coaxing to it, like he was speaking to a child. Shen Qiao watched as he fished out a flask of wine and uncorked the stopper. The aroma of wine immediately fanned out, wafting toward his nose. Shen Qiao took the flask, then tipped his head back and took a large gulp. His movement seemed somewhat urgent, and the wine trickled out from the corners of his lips, meandering down his throat and Adam's apple. When he lifted his eyes again, he saw Yan Wushi gazing at him. And though the relationship was already far from ordinary, Shen Qiao still felt a little embarrassed. That bamboo pole. Shen Qiao had already vaguely guessed what Yan Wushi wished to do. It wasn't as simple as Yan Wushi finding Asano and his group disagreeable and wanting to vent his frustrations. This man had always enjoyed spoiling other people's schemes. Even if no wind blew, he'd still find a way to stir up waves. And with the world showing signs of latent chaos, poised to reenact the scenes of confrontation between Northern Zhou and Southern Chun, he was bound to involve himself, secretly guiding the situation while fanning the flames, all so that he could profit from the chaos. And before he could determine what Yan Wushi would actually do, Shen Qiao decided to bide his time, to watch and wait. After all, even if the man known as Sect Leader Yan sometimes held wicked intentions, it didn't necessarily mean that he'd do wicked things. He had to concede that when it came to insight into the state of the world at large, his own still lagged behind Yan Wushi's. Either the wine isn't good or I'm too ugly, Yan Wushi said. Otherwise, how could your mind wander off in my venerable self's presence? A hand reached out unexpectedly, catching Shen Qiao off guard as it grabbed his cheeks. The great and lofty leader of the world's foremost Taoist sect, who'd appeared as steady as Mount Tai, enigmatic and unfathomable, vanished in an instant. All it took was the blink of an eye, and he'd transformed from refined and cultured to lovable and adorable. Seeing this, Ren Ying was so stunned. He even forgot about eating the chicken wing in his hand. Naming. It was an autumn day. The autumn winds whistled over thousands of miles of desolation and destruction, stretching as far as the eye could see. The land could never be restored to its original appearance. Qi Fengge led his horse to the Yellow River and stopped. Last year, the Yellow River had burst through the dikes, flooding countless acres of farmland and leaving thousands of people homeless. And today, both riverbanks were laid bare. Even though there were villages, they were scattered all about. The water surged and the winds wailed, whipping up his hem and sleeves. Even his sighs scattered on the winds. Last year, a flood. This year, a drought. Standing before the heavenly Tao, humans were utterly powerless. For the sake of allowing the horse to rest for a while, Qi Fengge was not in a hurry to mount and gallop off. Instead, he slowly proceeded on foot. Quite a few refugees passed him in twos and threes. When they saw the well-fed horse behind him, their eyes flickered with hunger and their mouths filled with saliva. They were only deterred from rash action by the long sword in his hand. The few that were starved to desperation and had lost their reason paid that no heed either, and they rushed toward him to take the horse. Naturally, Qi Fengge knocked them to the ground with a flick of his sleeve. In the beginning, when Qi Fengge had encountered these types, he'd shown them great kindness and shared his food with them. But he'd slowly come to realize that, though he could save one person, he couldn't save them all. And even if he could fill their bellies this time, without the reliable source for next time, or the time after that, they'd still end up starving to death. After watching this scene play out enough times, even the most compassionate of hearts would grow cold and hard. Qi Fengge didn't pay them any further heed. He leapt straight onto his horse and galloped off, leaving roiling dust in his wake. There were still a few days' worth of travel before he'd reach Xuandu Mountain. Qi Fengge wasn't in a hurry to get back, so he found a temple, intending to stay the night. The temple had been deserted for many years. The Buddha statue had toppled to the ground, and its head had somehow vanished. The emperor of Liang had believed in Buddhism, yet the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas had failed to save the people. In the end, he too had starved to death. Qi Fengge lit a fire and boiled some water. He'd almost achieved inertia, so eating was of little importance. As long as there were tiles above his head, he could spend the night meditating, and that would be all the rest he needed. A faint noise came from behind the pillar. Someone else might not have noticed, but Qi Fengge was somewhat astounded. With his hearing, he should have discovered the person the moment he'd entered, so either their breathing was too feeble or this hidden person was a powerful martial artist. "This one is Qi Fengge. May I ask which Taoist friend is here?" After a period of silence without receiving an answer, Qi Fengge rose and walked over. There he realized that behind the pillar was a large clay jar. He lifted the limestone slab covering it, and his gaze just happened to meet another pair of eyes. The other party was a child. Qi Fengge gentled his voice. "What's your name?" No response. Qi Fengge reached in, wanting to carry the child up and out, when pain suddenly flared in the back of his hand. The Xuandu Mountain sect leader, whom unrelated parties weren't even able to approach, had been bitten by a child. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The bite had drawn blood on the back of his hand. Threads of blood oozed out, and the fiery pain filled his hand. Qi Fengge sealed the child's acupoints, then lifted him out. He realized that the boy was at most 4 or 5 years old, and he was small and skinny. His entire face was smeared in grime. Even his face was unbound and matted. Fear was clear in his eyes. "Don't be afraid. I'm not a bad person." He didn't know if the boy was listening, but Qi Fengge was in no hurry to unseal his acupoints. First, he tore off a corner of his robe, then poured some hot water so he could wash it. After wringing out the cloth, he used it to wipe the boy's face. As the boy's face grew cleaner bit by bit, Qi Fengge couldn't help but make a sound of surprise. Though the child was frail, judging by that fair face and tender hands, which had never seen a day of labor, it was evident that the child must have been from a good background. "What's your name? Do you remember where your house is? I'll take you back to find your parents." Perhaps Qi Fengge's attitude had placated the boy, for even after he undid his acupoints, the child didn't scream or flee. He simply remained quiet, never replying to any of Qi Fengge's questions, right up until he took the flatbread he was offered and nibbled it. Only then did he say, "Water." "So you do know how to talk." Qi Fengge smiled and passed him some water. "Drink slowly and be careful not to eat too quickly or you'll get bloated." The boy was very well behaved. Even though he'd been hungry for a long time, he still left more than half of the flatbread and returned it to Qi Fengge. Qi Fengge surmised that the child must have come from a well-off home, and his heart melted a little more. "You can keep it. Eat it when you grow hungry again." The night grew deeper and the dew heavy. The child involuntarily leaned closer to the fire, and Qi Fengge removed his outer robe and draped it over his small body. Yet the boy tried to avoid it as he whispered, "Dirty." Qi Fengge swaddled him in the outer robe, then simply picked the boy up, holding him in his arms. "I don't mind being dirty." This warm embrace was something the boy hadn't felt since leaving home, and now it was as if he'd returned to his parents' arms. He almost thought that he could hear the faint sounds of his mother's loving teasing. He unknowingly dropped his guard and closed his eyes, then slipped into the land of dreams. "There's a broken down temple here. Come quick. Now we can take shelter from the wind. Shit, these stinking heavens. It's not even winter yet and the winds are already this fierce." Fierce winds are no matter. What's really eerie is that there's nowhere to eat for dozens of miles around us. We don't even know if we'll make it in time if we keep going. The 3 demonic sects are holding a meeting. This is really unprecedented. Perhaps we can also... The voices drifted closer, waking the child. He shrank into Qi Fengge's arms and peeked out. 2 large men walked in, one after the other. A puff of wind whirled in with them from outside, sending the flames into a frenzied dance. They'd already seen the fire glow from outside the temple and knew that there were people inside. That's why they'd deliberately come. People meant food. Inside was a Taoist priest with a timid little child. Seeing this, the two men were overjoyed. Though they could tell that this Taoist was someone from the Jianghu, he was only one person, and being only one person meant that he'd be weak. The two men strode in. It's too windy outside, so we came in for shelter and to warm ourselves by the fire. The Taoist master wouldn't mind, right? I don't own this place, said Qi Fengge. Please go ahead. Looked like this person was easy to persuade as well. The two men shared a glance, then sat down. Wu Wenguang said, Dozens of miles lie ahead of us, and there are but a few villages around. Is the Taoist master heading somewhere in particular? I was about to head home, Qi Fengge replied. I'm only passing through this place. Ji Chunjai laughed. So the Taoist master isn't heading to the assembly of the three demonic sects? Qi Fengge smiled, but didn't respond. The two new arrivals' stomachs growled in hunger. Seeing as they were unsuccessful in procuring any information on Qi Fengge's background, they stopped beating around the bush. We were searching our entire journey, but we saw no kitchen smoke from any of the village's chimneys. If the Taoist master has any rations, could he share them with us? In the future, we will definitely pay you back double. Qi Fengge coolly replied, I have none. He no longer needed to eat. He was practically capable of surviving on only wind and dew like an immortal. He'd given the only flatbread he had on him to the child in his arms. Ji Chunjai rolled his eyes. Instead of looking disappointed, he smiled instead. Looking at this young boy, he doesn't seem like the Taoist master's disciple or relative. Was he someone you chanced upon along the way? How about we strike a deal? Sell the child to us, and we'll pay you amply in silver. He pulled out a silver round from his sleeve and tossed it over. It landed right in front of Qi Fengge. Qi Fengge didn't even glance at it. What do you want with him? That's none of your concern, said Wu Wenguang impatiently. Qi Fengge raised his brow. Are you going to make him into Hegulan? Consuming humans for food wasn't uncommon during such tumultuous times. When it came to the victims, or two-legged sheep, as they were called, the flesh of children was tender and easy to cook, their flavor superior, hence the name Hegulan, or gentle and tender bones. It was unclear whether the boy could understand them or if he was simply afraid of these two malicious men. He clutched at Qi Fengge's arms tightly, his face pressed into Qi Fengge's robes, too fearful to raise his head. Qi Fengge gently reassured him, Don't be afraid, I won't hand you over. Wu Wenguang gave a cold humph. Think this through carefully. Boys like this are everywhere, antagonizing our Hehuan sect for his sake. Is it really worth it? Back then, even Sui Wang dared not speak to me like this, Qi Fengge said coolly. It seems like Zhuyue's sect truly just regresses with everything they do. Not only have they fragmented, they continue to wane, accepting anyone and everyone. In the beginning, when he'd been reticent, he'd only looked like an ordinary Taoist priest. At most, perhaps his demeanor seemed a little special. But when he spoke these words, his aura suddenly grew strong and imperious. Unfortunately, Wu Wenguang and Ji Chunjai's surprise only lasted a short moment, and they failed to be intimidated by his words. Instead, they barked out an ugly laugh. You've got guts. Then there's no need to waste more words on you. We'll seize and cook the two of you today. This even saves us some money. They were still speaking when Wu Wenguang's figure drifted in front of Qi Fengge. He moved in a flash with extraordinary speed, crooking his fingers into claws like an eagle after its prey, and brought his hand down on Qi Fengge's head. The little boy in Qi Fengge's arms only felt an ill wind blowing. He was about to raise his head, but it was like 1,000 pounds were crushing him from above. He couldn't lift his head an inch. Don't be afraid. It looked as though Qi Fengge was about to lose his life to Wu Wenguang's netherworld talons, yet he still had the leisure to comfort others? In Wu Wenguang's eyes, Qi Fengge was already a dead man. His fingertips had almost touched Qi Fengge's topknot, but it was only almost. White light flashed before his eyes. Wu Wenguang hadn't even been able to discern what was happening when a pain was burst in his chest. The next instant, His body was sent flying back, completely beyond his control. A mere moment later, he crashed heavily to the ground. Agony tore through his back, and his face was still frozen in his earlier expression of horrified surprise. He hadn't even had the time to change it. The nearby Ji Chunjai, who'd been prepared to leisurely watch the show from the sidelines, now realized that things weren't looking right. He immediately drew his sword and swept toward Qi Fengge. His movements were swift, his figure like smoke, as his sword glare arced like a rainbow. If the people from Liuli Palace in Fangjiang Isle were to rank his swordplay, they'd say that, though his skills were insufficient for the top 10, he'd still be a contender for a sword master's ranking. It was obvious that Ji Chuanjai was no mediocre swordsman. Ji Chuanjai was indeed quite satisfied with his swordplay. He thought that, although this stab of his didn't use his full power, it used around 9/10 of it, and that it was more than enough to deal with this Taoist in front of him. But his smile suddenly froze upon his face, because just as his sword glare was about to touch the other man's clothes, it suddenly halted in place. Or perhaps it should be said that his entire body, along with the sword, had been locked in place by some invisible force. It lasted only an instant, but it was enough for Ji Chuanjai to look like he'd seen a ghost. The next moment, like Wu Wenguang, he too had been sent flying backward, and a stabbing agony emanated from both his wrists. Qi Fengge rose. He carried the young boy in one arm while sheathing his sword with the other. "You don't deserve to use the sword," he told Ji Chuanjai. Ji Chuanjai was filled with both loathing and anger. He was practically about to vomit blood. The tendons! My hand! With the tendons of his hand severed, even if they could be reconnected, he'd never regain the same agility. This meant that he could never seek the summit of swordplay. At this time, Wu Wenguang was also drowning in regret. Had they known this man would be that difficult to deal with, they'd have never entered this broken-down temple. "We were too blind. We begged the Taoist master to please have mercy." Qi Fengge handed the sword to the child in his arms. The child accepted it as if it was second nature to him, holding it in his arms as if it were precious. Freeing his other hand, Qi Fengge brought his hand down to Wu Wenguang's head with a light slap. Wu Wenguang's eyes went round. He'd assumed that the man would kill him, but a moment later, his terror transformed into extreme rage. "You dare to destroy my martial arts?" Qi Fengge said, "The two of you wish to eat people, but since you were unsuccessful this time, I've destroyed your martial arts so that you can't commit more evils in the future." As he spoke, he moved to destroy Ji Chuanjai's martial arts as well when an airy chuckle drifted in from outside. He's a mediocre martial artist. Only his sword skills are somewhat acceptable. As sect leader Qi has severed the tendons of his hand, that should be enough. Why do something unnecessary? A cool breeze blew forth along with these words, shoving Ji Chuanjai back several steps and causing Qi Fengge to miss. The boy's eyes went round as he watched the young man who'd seemingly appeared from nowhere suddenly begin exchanging blows with the priest who was carrying him, their robes flapping and dancing. He lay between the two and watched, thoroughly dazzled. He couldn't tell at all what either of them were doing. A short while later, both men suddenly separated and landed solidly upon the ground. The young man spoke his praise. "Sect leader Qi is carrying a child and his sword unsheathed, yet I couldn't gain the upper hand at all. If not for this child dragging you down, we could have dueled to our heart's content." "When I was around Yan Gongzi's age," said Qi Fengge, "I didn't possess even half of his strength. With time, the new generation will replace the old. The world's Jianghu would depend on your generation then. Xuandu Mountain is the world's foremost Taoist sect, yet you're stuck in your old ways, focused on only guarding your gate. What's the point of your #1 position?" he snorted. "Even I'm dreary for your sake." Yan Wushi was an incredibly handsome man, his features almost beautiful, but he carried about him a sense of high-sky arrogance. This made his radiance even more awe-inspiring and even more exceptionally forceful. Qi Fengge smiled. To each their own. He'd already realized that this man's personality, combined with his astounding talents, would likely make him a character capable of shaking the world. The path to a Buddha, the path to a demon. Only a fine line separated the two. This person was from the demonic discipline, so naturally he couldn't become a Buddha. But right now, the Buddhist discipline was embroiled in their interests that involved the courts and mortal world, so they weren't that noble and virtuous either. With the addition of this type of character, these tumultuous times would only grow more troubled, and the common folk would only suffer more. Qi Fengge inwardly sighed. Yan Wushi said, "In the past, Ji Chunjai was somewhat involved with Sui Wang. Since I owed Sui Wang a favor, I'd like him to keep his life." Qi Fengge nodded. He had no intentions of making things difficult. "I already severed his tendons. If he can guarantee that he won't attack innocent civilians in the future, I won't do anything more to him." By now, from their conversation, Ji Chunjai had already realized just who Qi Fengge was. In his view, he and Wu Wenguang were truly beyond unfortunate. Otherwise, why would they run into the world's strongest martial artist? Though they couldn't afford to provoke him, they could at least hide from him. They were already lucky to be able to escape with their lives. How were they still in a position to bargain? He immediately swore an oath to the heavens, pledging that he'd never again take another person's life. Yan Wushi gave a faint smile. "Many thanks to Sect Leader Qi for saving me this face. If someday one of your disciples ends up in trouble, Huanyue sect will also offer them our help. Once." Wait, what? Oh my God. How could the disciples of the world's foremost Taoist sect end up in trouble so easily? But Yan Wushi had said it in a way that made it sound completely reasonable. Qi Fengge was a bit astonished. "I heard from them just now that there were 3 demonic sects, and I was confused as to when a new one had appeared. So Yan Gongzi has already established his own sect? Congratulations." Yan Wushi had never known the meaning of the word modesty. Hearing this, he nodded. "Many thanks." With no common topics, there was no point in further conversation. Qi Fengge and Yan Wushi were chance acquaintances with no relationship to speak of. Qi Fengge looked up at the first glimmers of dawn, then made to leave, still carrying the boy. "If there's a chance in the future, I will definitely come to seek guidance from Sect Leader Qi." Yan Wushi sent a leisurely glance at the child in his arms. "The boy has remarkable aptitude. If Sect Leader Qi doesn't wish to accept him as his disciple, why not hand him to me?" Qi Fengge raised a brow. After spending a night with the boy, he'd already grown very fond of him and harbored thoughts of taking him as his disciple. Now that someone was trying to take what he loved, he was naturally displeased. "There's no need for Sect Leader Yan to go to the trouble of meddling. Farewell." "Take care, Sect Leader Qi." Yan Wushi smiled, his hands behind his back as he watched Qi Fengge leave. Then he withdrew his smile as his gaze fell on the pair who'd tried to attack Qi Fengge. Meeting his frigid gaze, the pair felt their hearts chill. Though this man was young, all demonic practitioners knew of Yan Wushi's name. No one dared to look down on him. Meanwhile, Qi Fengge carried the boy out of the temple. After a night of fierce gales, the wind had finally stopped. A faint radiance peeked through the layers of clouds, as if promising that this coming day would be a bright, shining one. Seeing the way the boy was gripping his lapels, his gaze rapt and unblinking, Qi Fengge couldn't help but laugh. "Fear not, I won't abandon you. Would you like to go back with me? I live atop the mountain. You'll have many Shishong and Shidi around your age there, and you can accept me as your master and call me Shitsun." "Shitsun!" The child crisply addressed him without the slightest hesitation. "Good boy." Qi Fengge patted his head. "I almost forgot to ask. Do you still remember your name?" "Shen." "Shen and—" The child thought hard, finger in his mouth. "Qiao." Qi Fengge was incredibly patient. "Which Qiao?" The child shook his head, bewildered. He was still young, and he'd suffered through a long period of wartime chaos, so he didn't remember. Qi Fengge put him down. With his arm around the boy, he dragged his sword across the ground, using the sheath to write the character Qiao. Then we'll use this one. How about it? The boy's expression was perplexed and conflicted. Too hard. Qi Fengge laughed. It's not hard. Here, I'll teach you. He held the boy's hand and showed him each and every stroke. The character Qiao was etched there upon the sand, straight and neat. The hundreds of gods does he placate, the peaks and rivers all partake. In the future, I hope you'll become someone like the peaks and summits, a man broad in both mind and heart. All right, everyone, that concludes the reading of the 3 chapters Wish, Ren Ying, and Naming. And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed reading these for the first time. They were super cool. The first 2 chapters, which were terribly long, by the way, but not terribly in a bad way, I considered them like the adventures of Shen Qiao and Yan Wushi badassing through the Central Plains and saving random people. It was so cute. Even though, of course, this stuff, it was random, but it also wasn't random at the same time. The other thing that I enjoyed about reading these is really just that last chapter, Naming. It was really cool to see the first fight between Yan Wushi and Qi Fengge, or the fight from them two, because when he talked about it, I did not know, number one, that Shen Qiao was there. And apparently Shen Qiao also doesn't really remember that he was there, but it wasn't as intense as I thought it actually was. And when Qi Fengge said those words to him, just like that whole scenario, it actually wasn't what I thought it was. I thought Yan Wushi found him one day and was like, let's duel. But that's not really what happened. Not to say it didn't happen again in the future, but considering how it was worded in this chapter and what was explained in the past, I believe this was the actual duel or fight-ish between them. So I was just really happy that Meng Xi Shi put that in here. Also, it's just crazy how cyclical everything is, and just the way that that framed out. Coincidentally, I'm putting air quotes that you guys can't see, before the child that Qi Fengge to save, of course, being Shen Qiao and meeting Yan Wushi and them, working out that thing with those 2 terrible cannibalistic starving men from He Huan sect, and Yan Wushi saying, like, one time when one of your disciples is in trouble, I got you. And that turned out to be that very child right there. I also thought it was funny, just like he did when Shen Qiao was an adult. He was trying to snag him as a disciple. But he could never snag him. Anyway, these chapters were nice. Very, very nice. So that leaves us with the last 3 chapters, the past, New Year's Eve, and Weibo's something, I don't remember. But you all have a wonderful day or a wonderful night. I will see you next time, and 我爱你们.